life of an artist, by its very nature, is precarious and challenging. We can become overwhelmed by dogma, by convention. Sometimes we give in and hide ourselves away, like Diogenes in his tub. At other times, we turn and face the establishment and step out.
He pulled each one out of the kiln, turned it, and then would put it aside. And he'd take another one out and turn it, and then he'd take the hammer and smash it straight away. If it wasn't up to what he considered to be an appropriate standard, he would smash it there and then.
I met Bob in 1994. By then he was in his 80s. It was shortly after the birth of his second child. He had a head of thick white hair and a moustache to match. Handsome and charismatic, he could have been a retired Hollywood actor. I particularly remember his large bright eyes. Later I learned he'd plucked out his eyelashes during the war because they brushed against the glass of his gas mask. They never grew back. As a young ceramist, he studied under State Murray and Dora Billington. He had work exhibited at the V&A as well as other prestigious galleries. Here in his studio, which is unchanged since his death, you get a sense of his remarkable energy and relentless passion. When we first discussed making a film about his life, it seemed a straightforward task. But Bob wasn't a man who could be pinned down or pigeonholed. His life and art defied convention. In many ways, Bob's work bridged the divide between disciplines, and this unsettled the art establishment. His work confounded critics and curators. They couldn't decide. Was it pottery or was it painting? Was it art or craft? But did it and should it matter? Bob's ideas and those of his peers continue to inspire new generations of artists. In this film, we hope to uncover the real Bob Washington. What drove him and what can we learn from his legacy?
If it wasn't up to what he considered to be an appropriate standard, he would smash it there and then while sitting in front of the kiln. And I found that absolutely staggering. In that time that I worked with him, I started not liking him and ended up absolutely in awe.
My father was an art school principal, and he believed that one had to get all the pieces of paper, all the qualifications first, and when one had done that, then it was possible to starve in an attic as an artist afterwards. This is the early work which I did at the art school. We had to copy old masters. The Botticelli there is about a third size of the original. We also had to study a certain amount of textile printing and simple graphics. We had to do wood engraving and experiment with brushwork in all its various forms. So for 7 years I spent my time drawing and painting, and it was only at the end that I turned to the use of clay. You see, my father was a brilliant draftsman, and he'd done everything so well that I was overshadowed by his ability. it wasn't until I discovered that he'd done hardly any work in clay that I realised that I had a chance to use something in my own right instead of being overshadowed by him.
At the Contemporary Ceramics Centre in Bloomsbury, you can see the range and breadth of 21st century ceramics. In 2003, Grayson Perry won the Turner Prize. He was the first ceramist to do so. His success reminds us of ceramics' ability to communicate to a wide audience.
These are exciting times, but what was it like in the 1930s when Bob was a student at the Royal College of Art?
I think up until State Murray's appointment, the main reason or the main work of the department had been very much almost totally industry oriented. It was actually one of the first courses to be started when the college was founded, and it was very much about training painters, paintresses, decorators for the ceramic industry. I think with State Murray's appointment, we started to see a much more holistic exploration of the potential of ceramic.
These were amongst the first pots that I made.
I remember him telling me about wearing green trousers and a orangey red shirt at the Royal College when he was a student, and that was so flamboyant for those days.
Dora Billington, who taught him a lot technically, she was already beginning to encourage students to look more broadly around them for ideas and create this sense that you could use a clay as a baseline. It could also take you into all sorts of uncharted areas.
And these down here are illustrations of the pots I was producing in 1938 when I was fortunate enough to have the Victoria and Albert Museum buy the two larger pots on the right.
He represented part of a very exciting new generation of ceramic artists who were breaking through at that moment. Just their form is quite extraordinary, and they have a real elegance. They're thrown beautifully, and they have amazing kind of vertical appearance. They're around 2 feet or so high, but they have this kind of soaring aspect to them. When the acquisition of those pots was made, it was part of a group of objects that came to the museum from the Brygos Gallery, the last exhibition held at the Brygos Gallery, in fact, which was a 3-person show with Gwilym Thomas, Bob Washington and Henry Hammond showing together. And they talk about the excellent shapes and the decoration being pleasing, and the fact that they show this welcome, what they describe as a welcome break away from the Murray tradition. Not that I think that they want that's in any way derogatory to the Murray tradition, but the excitement of moving forward, of these makers moving forward.
If you talk about the 30s, it's often said that Bernard Leach down in St Ives was very much an artist potter, but the stress being very much on the pot, whereas of course with State Murray and someone like Bob Washington and Sam Hale, that group of people, it was also just as much about the painting on the pot. In a sense, you were looking at a 3-dimensional painting.
And then of course, just when I was thinking that I would starve in an attic, as my father had said I could do if I wanted, now that I'd got all the paperwork done, I found that life was beginning. I was getting part-time teaching. I helped Miss Billington, who was a well-known potter in London, to do Ministry of Education courses. When everything looked as set as though I might well become a potter, but the world decided otherwise and decided to have a war, into which I disappeared for 5 years.
And what was he there? He was an aircraft fitter, which actually puts him into a different kind of perspective. But I was in the RAF, and aircraft fitters were the top the absolute top of the technical skill. It's an indication of the breadth of the man, that, he could talk about the classics and he could also talk about repairing his tractor.
After the war, Bob returned to education, taking various posts, before rising to the position of Her Majesty's Inspector for Art Education for the County of Essex. It would be nearly 30 years before he returned to the kiln full-time.
R.J. Washington was one of the great names in 20th century ceramics, but I think that a lot of people thought he was dead. He was an extremely famous potter, but very much in the past tense. It was a very nice surprise to know that suddenly he was still alive and he was making interesting pots.
Firstly, he was so cool. He was just so cool. This guy with this great long white hair, and the moustache was always fabulous. I just loved his look and immediately thought, oh, this is somebody I could talk to. He was going to be cool. Exploring this potential for this thing that held oxygen, that breathed, that echoed bodies, that was a repository.
The next page will show what I was doing and how I was researching simple iron glazes of the traditional type. Because all my shapes now began to be created around the figure, breast, belly, legs, foot and so on, it seemed to me to be fairly obvious that if one was going to take the figure as a starting point, it was only natural that the decoration on the pot should be from the figure as well. I began to realise that a lot of the lines I was putting on the pots were coming and going on the surface, but I realised that this is becoming to a certain extent insincere because I was relying upon the kiln to get rid of a lot of my work and to give it something that I hadn't myself ordained.
I just thought they were the most beautiful marriage between finding form and using it to express a variety of things.
It's a language of space and mass and rims and that sort of transition from inside to outside. It's a very rich vocabulary.
In the middle of the 80s, I think I began to get where I wanted to be, where the shapes began to move in and out, into and out, rather than sitting along the surface of the pot.
He would take a pot like this and he would put it horizontally and say, that's a kind of landscape. Can you see that it's the line of a landscape? But it's not only the line of a landscape, but it's rolling this way as well.
When I got to this point, I can remember that we used to say, and I said it myself, that while I have taught you to regard stoneware as having its specific classical restrictions, I now want you to say, this is what he says. Now I'm going to turn it upside down and I'm going to do everything the opposite way.
He was breaking the rules and I was learning them, and we were both overlapping on anything goes.
At this point I thought, right, I will turn things upside down. I will let the clay spin in my fingers until it tears away. I will cut it. I'll scrape it and scratch it. I'll put metal with it. And I realised, I can distinctly remember the moment when I actually threw that particular part. I can remember as I stopped looking and thinking, I'll hang on until it tears, and I made myself hang on until it tore, which was foreign to all that I'd done before. And as it tore, and I stepped back and I looked at it, I thought, Jesus, look at that wonderful edge. I couldn't have drawn that if I wanted. And from that moment onwards, I realised that there was a whole new ball game. So I've added fiberglass, I've put ball bearings in, nuts, bolts, broken metals, I've scratched it and dented it. I took a flat sheet of plate, pushed a piece of wood in it, yanked them up until they broke and tore, pushed them around one another, left all the edges as they came out of under the rolling pin or the slabber.
He was really into the business of ceramic chemistry and to ways of firing and into what happens to certain glazes under reduction, and almost always wanting to work on it in a reduced firing.
And then he had the sheds, that you walked into this, like through the looking glass. And not just the work and the experiments with ceramic, the bits of equipment and rusted crap that just engaged him.
Everything that you can think of that would stand a fire, old pieces of metal rusted off the top of the kiln, pieces of fiberglass, like drawn threadwork from a fiberglass curtain, then immersing it into a form of glaze that would hold the fibre from melting out, overlaid it in place, all wet. And the theme all through: earth, air, fire and water.
It's almost unique as a material as much as it exists in so many different fundamental forms and states. And depending on the state you're working it in, different qualities can be achieved.
He would go back to the materials that he was using, so that it seemed always to start from a new approach to the material.
And these are things like ceramic paper, ceramic blanket, all the ceramic things that have come into being in recent years, partly for the nose cone of things that have been to the moon, I believe, and back, but also for the purpose of making kilns and making furnaces.
I think he really didn't give a damn about whether other people understood his work or not.
And the teacher who takes credit for that, who isn't given enough credit for it, is State Murray. And State Murray was a lousy teacher. He didn't teach us a blowing thing, but he gave us an attitude of mind. And the attitude of mind was that our work, our clay work, belonged as much in the sculpture and painting world as did anything else.
With State Murray, it was far more part of the ethos of I am an artist first and foremost, and then I'm a potter. And I think Bob inherited that. But I'm much more interested in the clay than State Murray was. Bob Washington was a wonderful example of a stayer. I mean, there was no let-up in that activity, particularly towards the end.
So with this in mind, I thought, perhaps I will try and bridge the gap that there seems to be coming between the ceramist, potter, and the painter. I've used these materials and turned them into art materials. Anything goes that will stand the kiln, whether it be metal or ceramic thread or blanket or paper. Glaze, glass, clay, the process of taking flux and silica. The theme really is one of Alice in Wonderland. A flux in one hand, silica and alumina in the other hand. As you wish to raise the temperature, you use your right hand with the alumina and silica in, and you increase that. And if you wish to lower it, you use the flux that's in the other hand. And with these two bits of mushroom, all these are created.
I think he saw his work in the way that you would look at, we'll say, a Giacometti or a Henry Moore. We went into the craft centre and he started to talk to them about the possibility of doing an exhibition of his work. And the quick response was, well, not really, Mr. Washington, because you're really fine art and, you're not that we're really into the craft tradition. And then he took me into a gallery, a fine art gallery, and asked them if they do an exhibition. They said, well, no, we don't do craft work, we only do fine art.
There were clear distinctions between the craft world and the art world, and they were institutionalized. I mean, we had a crafts council then, as well as the arts council. The art world wasn't interested in clay. They didn't know what to make of Bob's things.
Brushing, dragging, palette knifing, and where do we stop? We're now into painting, aren't we? So that we've got all the tools of the painter, all the tools of the potter, all the potential of the kiln, and yet we can paint, if you like to use the word, or we can use all the knifing, running, dragging, spraying, dipping and so on that the painter can use. And we've got all the crawling and crazing and bubbling and all the rest of it that the potter has.
I remember saying to him, I don't know what I can say, Bob. I have no idea of how to respond to these, you know. And then that was when he took me back to show me where it had come from and that they were space-age materials, that they were new ceramic materials.
Anatole Orient came as usual, and he came and looked at it, and he walked up and down. He said, well, Bob, all the people that I sell to come to buy pots. They come to buy ceramic articles. And these are paintings.
I guess by then, the people who were getting attention were making work that, even if it wasn't functional ceramic, was still echoing the forms and the recognizable shapes, etc. And the work he was currently doing, the platters and then eventually the flat panels, they had no resemblance to ceramic objects.
I contacted one of the most prestigious galleries in London, the Redfern Gallery in Cork Street. And she walked up and down and made a great fuss. Colour, quality, this, that and the other. She got to the end, she looked a bit distressed. She said, look, I'm awfully sorry, but I just can't say anything. I just feel I must get away and think for a moment. I will write you tonight. And her letter said, on giving the matter much thought, all the clowns that come into my gallery come in to buy paintings and prints. And these are ceramic.
He didn't care anymore. So he said, okay, so you want a painting? I'll give you a ceramic painting with the palette knife and the brush and all the techniques of painting. Then he put it in a kiln.
They are, for all intents and purposes, paintings, using ceramic media. They adopt the conventions of painting, the rectangular format, and then exist in quite abstract way.
It was not long after the Pearl Diver that he started doing the modellings.
And I remember him having some Picasso drawings up in his studio that were not like his work at all, except that they were the abstracting of the natural form.
Fiberglass used as a ceramic material where it is made to become part of a ceramic medium because it's dipped and mixed with ceramic materials like glaze and slip. And in these I began to see what the effect would be of melting the surface after they're fired with an oxyacetylene torch. I used an oxyacetylene torch on those and on that in order to melt areas to see what would happen if I blasted my way through them. After that, I became absolutely engrossed in the manner in which things grow with a twist.
There was this energy that you really, apart from a potter named Dan Kelly and a couple of others in this country, you really only saw in American ceramics. Bob was working out on a limb. He knew it. And he just never accepted the fact that there was hardly anybody out on that limb. I'd go out on that limb with him.
I think he was an explorer in the proper sense of the word. I think that he used clay as a means of release, and for him it wasn't a confining medium. It was very much the opposite of that. It allowed him to properly explore, to really test the materials that he was working with.
I didn't want to lose the potter part of making something that tends to contain. So the containing portion was difficult to include, but it is here and there. I shall carry this spiral on until it goes round and so encloses space again. Something which is not pottery to something which is between sculpture and a vessel.
Bob was as engaged with the things that didn't work as those that did, because he had such an interest in things happening, not just existing up in your head.
And what I love about particularly the late work, it almost comes closer than I can think of someone like Angus Suttie, who is of a younger generation in this country. But his late work, it relates in some ways to American funk ceramics that was going on in the 60s.
I've gone back to the bowl, and I thought, well, if that is to be turned upside down in its attitude, I have to see to it that it is non-thrown. It is not clean-edged, it is torn, it is just roughly applied, and the glaze has to pour down and hang off. The clay is broken and torn and jagged. Nothing is round, nothing is neat and tidy. It is all, I hope, fairly forceful and direct. And the pots, I'm now trying to change and to bring up colour of the sorts that I've been using. However different they may be, they're still the same in so many ways. And this is a theme taken from one of the paintings, if you call them the panels. It's also taken from Omar Khayyam.
I'm really fond of the blue that he used. It's just so vibrant and there's so much depth to it in the big house. There was one of his platters, and I always remember every time I would either go in or out of the room, I'd love to feel the texture of it because it was just so raw and different from anything else that I'd ever experienced.
Washington is a wonderful example of a potter who fell between two stools. His work could never properly settle in any particular gallery. He was that great thing. He was an artist who covered several disciplines.
He was this wildly, wonderfully eccentric Englishman. He was the folly in his own garden, and I mean that in the most loving possible way.
In 1997, after a short battle with cancer, Bob threw his last pot. I wanted to find out what influence Bob and his peers have had on current ceramists.
Hello, come on through. Seeing how his work evolved from those very precise forms that he was working on to much more experimental stuff, I thought I could really relate to that in terms of how I approach my work as well. I'm very much interested in the material and how the material behaves. I want the material to do something as well. I want to say, okay, if I set this up, what are you going to do? What are you going to bring to it? So it's absolutely critical to how I work that there's that sort of toing and froing, and I find it more interesting because there's always a chance of something random happening. I think it's important to keep developing, keep moving it forward, keep looking out for something different that's happening and see where you can take it.
I think they were hugely brave, that generation of artists, hugely brave. I think it's one of the things that's exciting as a curator, actually, is to try and go back and recapture something of that in the way you present the work, because it's very easy to lose sight of how original and how groundbreaking this work was.